Um, my name is Dan Orrells. I'm a lecturer at King's College London. Welcome to Queer at King's College London. Queer at King's is a research centre in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at King's. And usually we'd be meeting up in person, but obviously the world is different at the moment. But I'm really delighted to say that this is our inaugural event, our first event for this academic year, for 2020-2021. And I couldn't be more delighted to introduce Paul Mendez, author of Rainbow Milk. And at the same time, I'd also like to introduce Ali Gordon, our BSL interpreter. So welcome both to Paul and Ali to Queer at King's, and also welcome to everybody who's come to attend this event here on Zoom. Now, I'd just like to ask everyone, I think you've already done that, but if everyone could switch off their microphones and if everyone could switch off their videos, that would be great. And then we can focus on the protagonists for the evening, Paul, and we can see Ali doing the BSL signs for us, so we're as accessible as possible. So without further ado then, let me introduce Mr. Paul Mendez to everyone. Paul is a London-based novelist, an essayist and a screenwriter of Jamaican heritage. He was born in 1982 and he was raised as Jehovah's Witness in the Black country. Mendes dissociated himself from the witnesses whilst he was still a teenager. And in 2020, Dialogue Books published Rainbow Milk, which is a portrait of a Black British family between the Windrush era and the EU referendum, from the perspective of a queer young runaway. It featured on the Observer's prestigious top 10 debut novels list, so congratulations. And the novel was also shortlisted for the Gordon Byrne Prize. And Paul has contributed to Esquire, The Face, Vogue, Times Literary Supplement, and Brixton Review of Books. And he's currently reading for the MA in Black British Literature at Goldsmiths, University London. So without more ado then, I'm going to switch off my camera and my microphone, and I'm going to hand over to Paul, who's going to open the evening with a reading from a scene in the novel. And then I'll come back on board and open up the question and answer session. And I'll open up with a few questions from myself, and then I'll be monitoring the chat function for any of your questions. So if you do have any questions, please just post them in the chat and we can go from there. So Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening. I'm just going to go straight into a reading from Rainbow Milk. Pages 102 to 103. At home, he confined himself to his tiny room. He took his clothes to the laundrette on Hilltop and mainly ate at work. One day, traipsing home up Carlton Street after working a breakfast shift, a car stopped next to him. It was Brother Thomas Woodall, in his painting and decorating clothes. He was often to be seen, driving up and down as he worked on several projects at once, from a shop front in Great Bridge to the home of a brother and sister in a neighbouring territory. Brother Woodall silently reached over to the passenger door of his minivan and with his neck beckoned Jessie in. Jessie obeyed, got in the car and shut the door, even though he was only 5 minutes' walk from his house. The escort van was filthy inside, incommensurate with Brother Woodall's usually impeccable presentation, as presiding overseer of the congregation. But of course, being a white man, Brother Woodall's filth was cleaner than Jesse's squeaky clean black. He drove up almost to the top of Burton Lane just to take a longer route to drop Jesse off at home. They didn't say a word to each other. And when Jesse, fighting back tears, tried to say thank you, Brother Woodall turned his head away. Jesse got out of the car and stood grieving on the pavement as Brother Woodall drove away. Christmas, he stayed in his room with crisps and snacks, craving a spliff, even a cigarette. His parents and the children watched TV downstairs all day. He was not invited to eat with them. He'd bought Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, finally, which his GCSE English teacher had encouraged him to read. It dawned on him that the novel depicted a gay relationship. He panicked to think she might have recommended it to him because he was a black gay like Baldwin. Still, he managed it in one day from cover to cover. He thought it striking that a black man could, in the first paragraph, have his main character look himself in the mirror and see a tall, blonde white man standing there in his dressing gown, holding a tumbler of whiskey, and it brought a tear to his eye, because he recognized that if he was a tall, blonde white boy, everything would have been different. He recognized that he had thought of himself as a blonde white boy all his life. He'd never thought of himself as a black boy or compared himself to other black people. He'd known so few black people, and those his mother knew she often derided for being too black, doing things in too black a way, being late because they were too black, being disorganized because they were too black, being rough and uneducated because they were too black. He wouldn't have been treated so harshly if he wasn't too black. He wouldn't be cooped up in a prison cell, an exile within the family home, too embarrassed to accept any of his workmates' invitations to spend Christmas with them and their families if he wasn't too black. He knew that he would have to spend the rest of his life convincing people that he wasn't too black. He managed to keep himself together until Easter, when the witnesses, separately from the main branches of Christendom, marked the Passover, which Jesse refused to attend. He came home from work that night, stoned, just as Graham was closing down the house to go to bed. They looked at each other. Jesse, unexpectedly to himself, started to cry. "Sorry," he said. "I'm sorry." He kept saying, "I'm sorry." He moved towards Graham and put his head on his shoulder. Graham remained unmoved, hands by his sides. All Jesse wanted was some love. He hugged him, squeezed him, grabbed handfuls of his flesh, smelled his neck, kissed him, leaked tears into him. Graham, firmly, grabbed Jesse by both arms and held him away from himself. Through his teeth, he said, "You have to get out of this house."
Thank you very much. That was a really moving reading, and there are so many amazing scenes in this novel, and that was one moment that really stuck with me, yeah, made me think about a lot of things, and really brought a big lump to my throat at the same time. So yeah, and yeah, I think it's done the same thing again, actually. So it's very, very moving.
I was so sorry. I should have picked something more sort of like zhuzhy and fun for this very depressing lockdown.
It's brilliant. So let me open up the question and answer session then. So Rainbow Milk is based on personal experiences, and I was interested in, what ways does writing a novel using personal experience free you or constrain you as a writer?
Well, I feel that as, you know, a Black, British, queer, ex-Jehovah's Witness, ex-sex worker, you know, I have such a wealth of material to work with. And, you know, in writing, I couldn't move away from that. You know, I tried, but I really just had to deal with this material first before I sort of move on, hopefully, to other subjects later on. Having said that, I probably always will sort of work within the sort of framework of my intersections. But writing fiction was really the only way that this could be possible. I could have written a memoir, and indeed, I did sort of put together a sort of collection of fragments of life writing and essay and poetry and stuff, and that's what sort of constitutes my sort of the Rainbow Milk, if you like, that I sent to my publisher back in 2017. And she and her then the commissioning editor of Little Brown, Dominic Wakeford, challenged me to turn that into a novel. And even then, it was a great challenge for me to sort of separate myself from what I was writing. And it only really happened actually when I switched to third person and, you know, created the character of Graham. You know, my dad's Black, so creating a white adoptive father for Jesse just sort of, you know, allowed him to perhaps explore the same subjects that I still had to go through, such as you know, self-denial of my sort of Black masculinity, etc., but through a sort of more believable, I suppose, perspective, or more accessible perspective, because, you know, Jesse's masculinity is always being judged within the framework of white masculinity. So it was both challenging, but also very, very, very freeing to switch to third person and to sort of step outside from my own frame of experience and watch someone like Jesse. Having said that as well, I'm twice the age that Jesse is in the when we first sort of meet him. So, you know, whilst I went through some of the things that he did, I don't really remember. And, you know, to create sort of scenes in which, you know, Jesse's, you know, experiencing, you know, sex with men for the first time, experiencing alienation from family, alienation from his religious environment. These are all things that I don't necessarily remember. So I did have to sort of step into a much more creative space, a space in which I was very much divorced from the material in order to sort of judge it subjectively, objectively, even. I always got the two mixed up. So. And yeah, just sort of be his amanuensis almost, and sort of put a camera on his shoulder and really sort of look at things from his perspective and sort of completely within his frame of reference, but still to deal with some of the things that I share with him. So yeah, it just became, once I sort of realized that that was the way forward in terms of writing from a perspective of memory, observation, and imagination, I was certainly able to sort of, yeah, steam forward and have fun with that, and sort of basically develop a practice as a fiction writer.
It's really interesting because there's such an efflorescence at the moment of non-fiction, you know, which is neither fiction nor fact, and you know, lots of writers are really interested in the, you know, in the last few years in exploring that in-between zone, actually.
Yeah, I was very, at the beginning of the sort of adaptation, I guess, process, was looking into Jeanette Winterson's Oranges Not the Only Fruit and James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, and finding, you know, inspiration in those, but also using acting technique in order to sort of access characters. So, you know, the opening section of the book, the first 48 pages are told in the first person narrative voice of a gentleman called Norman, who emigrated to the UK from Jamaica in 1956 with his wife, Claudette. And he's sort of speaking in his sort of present day of 1959. He'd by now got 2 small children. And unfortunately, you know, despite the fact that he came here as a very fit and healthy man, has come upon illness and disability, which means he can't work. His wife, who as a woman earns less than him, has to go out and get 2 jobs, working around the clock to sort of provide for the family in the way to the financial degree that he was able to. So he's left at home as the homemaker, and he is almost blind, completely blind. He's a very big man. He's sort of 6'4", ex-boxer, and he's just incredibly sort of scared that he's going to trample his kids underfoot. So, you know, we're hearing his testimony, telling us of his hopes and fears for his children's futures. And I accessed his character through, you know, I played Othello, I'd done a bit of acting. So I was able to sort of access the physicality and the voice. And I actually sort of recorded myself speaking in his first person voice, in Jamaican patois, recorded myself, and the transcript of that became the first draft of what is now the opening section of Rainbow Milk. So it wasn't simply a case of just looking at sort of what else is out there in terms of creative nonfiction, but using what I had within my own sort of toolkit to create material and to create a legacy for Norman. For example, you know, Jesse's his grandson. And so we see through Jesse the legacy of what the Windrush generation that Norman represents went through and how that impacts on Jesse's life. And once I was able to see those kinds of things sort of rise up from the text, it really informed the rest of it, really informed me being able to fill in the gaps.
Okay, that's really, really interesting. And building on, you know, what you mentioned, the first part of the novel, set in 1959. And one of the many things I loved about reading Rainbow Milk was how you brought together a story about the Black British experience in the 1950s and a story about a young Black gay man in London in the 21st century. And so for me, it felt you're making a really fascinating intervention in Black British fiction, but also queer fiction as well. And so could you talk more about the importance of intersectionality for you as a writer?
Well, I mean, I could answer that question simply, or I could sort of go off on a 10 million year tangent.
Please.
You know, you know, I come from, you know, I probably stand at a pretty sort of complex Venn diagram when it comes to intersectionality, Black British, Afro-Caribbean heritage, gay, ex-Jehovah's Witness, grew up in, you know, the West Midlands, which is ironically, you know, it's the Black country, but, you know, I grew up in a very sort of, you know, the British National Party were, you know, it was a stronghold for them, my borough, when I was growing up. You know, I grew up in the same region as Enoch Powell was a constituency MP, and he gave his famous Rivers of Blood speech in Birmingham about, you know, inspired by poor white members of his constituency in Wolverhampton, and their sort of disgust at the numbers of my grandparents' generation who were moving into their areas and sort of taking their jobs and et cetera, et cetera. You know, my parents grew up with that as children, sort of not knowing really what was going on over their heads. And, you know, my parents' generation, I think, quite traumatized by that and perhaps don't have the tools that I have now as, you know, someone who studies a degree and someone who, you know, reads. I mean, to be honest, it was only really when I read Small Island by Andrea Levy that I realized that that was my legacy. I'd never sort of, you know, I'd asked my parents what their lives were like in the West Indies and, you know, what they were like when they first moved to the UK. And they were very circumspect about it. You know, for them, that was the past. We're in the mother country now. We've brought you here to sort of, you know, have a great education and to be English. And that's fine, but, you know, and I sort of see myself as being English, but does England see me as being English, or does it see me as the other? And it took me a long time. It was really only sort of when I came to understand the theory of intersectionality and that I was an intersectional person, that I understood that there was a framework for that, and that what I was feeling, this sort of sense of belonging, but also isolation and lack of belonging, for want of a better word, is a broader experience shared by lots of people, from Black feminists to South Asian workers to et cetera, et cetera. So it really sort of gives me a means of breathing, if you like, as a writer. And yeah, I guess we all need to see things from each other's perspectives sometimes. It's not just, political sort of movements happen, etc., but it's not just one group of people that experiences it in one way. And so it's just really important for us to hear from people like Jesse, who is speaking, at the time of Brexit, towards the end of the novel, and telling us his hopes and fears as a Black queer man, telling us, how his future feels like it's been taken away from him. And I think it's quite telling that intersectionality and, critical race theory are coming back into the headlines. It's very telling that, the President of the United States of America, outgoing, sort of brought that into debate, because, one of the tenets of critical race theory is that the hegemony will not do anything about racism unless it benefits them. And so there's a real fear of it, because critical race theory and intersectionality being a tenet of that is sort of the first time really where we as people of color, we as queer people, etc., can hold people to account, can hold the hegemony to account. And it's something that the hegemony cannot control. So, I really sort of hope for a really intense debate over intersectionality. And I'm really glad to be part of that conversation as an intersectional writer.
Because, there are obviously novels about the Windrush generation, like Small Island, and then there are, there's sort of gay fiction or queer fiction on the other hand. And I think for me, what was, so exciting about Rainbow Milk is how by thinking about Jesse's story and thinking about Jesse's heritage, it allows you and us as your readers to understand a long arc of modern British history in the post sort of 1945 period. And if you focus on Jesse and his story and where he comes from, that actually gives you a really good way of thinking about the connections between the 1950s and the 21st century. And it offers readers a way of understanding through fiction the kind of long, deep origins of what's been happening really in the last 5 years politically. There was the Windrush scandal under Theresa May, and obviously there's Brexit and Trump and the rest of it. And so by focusing on a young queer Black protagonist, it's brilliant, fascinating how that offers actually maybe the best, there are many other ways, of course, but one of the best ways of actually understanding British history. And, traditional hegemonic ways of conceptualizing British history don't include queer Black protagonists, do they?
Yeah. Well, that's because there's been so few of us in published literature. And that's not to say that there aren't many of us being written or writing. It's just, the publishing industry is now sort of it's starting to get up to speed in terms of who's out there. And, I wasn't the finished article when I sent my work to Charmaine Lovegrove, but she believed that given the time and given a bit of trust and support, could become a voice. And, to add to the conversation. So, we need to think a little bit more about, who we allow to tell stories, what sort of standards we put on them, and what kind of space or not we allow them to grow in or not. So, I'm, really delighted that I was given the opportunities that I've been given. Having said that, I've been in sort of literary agents' offices before, and they've said, you know, why don't you just do this, like, you know, Arvin course for like £9,000 or whatever, you know, intersectionality. Like, I'm not rich, I'm not middle class. Like, you might be speaking to people like, you know, that who have that money, or they can ask their parents for that money, but I can't. So, you know, does that sort of rule me and my story out? Does that rule out my voice as a Black queer person who's been through that, and that? But yeah, I mean, you know, I'm third generation Black British Afro-Caribbean, and I think each generation has sort of experienced Britishness differently. And so, you know, it's fascinating really to sort of compare, or put the generations side by side and to sort of compare the experience, to see what sort of stands out from each generation, but also to see what they have in common. Also, you know, because of, you know, colonial laws and sort of attitudes that sort of still prevail in some societies, it's kind of difficult to envisage like the majority Black British experience being in the same room as the queer Black British experience. So, you know, a lot of kids, you know, my age and older, a lot of people my age and older have found it difficult to sort of, you know, come out to family and all of this kind of thing, you know, people even younger than me. So, you know, putting the two in the room, it just is maybe not often that you see that in Black British fiction, but that sort of discussion is facilitated. And it's strange because, you know, even now I sort of, to an extent, expect homophobia from certain sort of aspects of the community that I come from. So, you know, it feels like a massive coming out again. Like, you know, I came out like 20 years ago, but like this feels like I'm coming out again. You know, especially when you talk about sex work and stuff like that as well. You know, it feels like, you know, Paul, what are you doing? Like, they're gonna hate you. But at the end of the day, I can't really worry about that. It's my responsibility to tell the story of these people and sort of how they sort of get through life, being who they are.
Brilliant, thank you. And religion is also a fascinating theme, really central throughout the novel. And I was struck by the references to the Garden of Eden in the first part of the novel, narrated by Norman. And in the second part, we get a real sense of sometimes the attractiveness and the pull of the Jehovah's Witness community. And, you know, the novel is really clear about the damage that organized religion can do, but also it's really sensitive about what religious communities can offer us on the other hand. And so I wondered why it was important, or why it might have been important for you to write about religion with this level of subtlety and complexity.
Well, thank you. I think, you know, from speaking personally, you know, I grew up as a Jehovah's Witness, and I sort of found it, I loved it. You know, I had this sort of huge extended family, everyone's brother this, sister that. I spent, you know, so much of my childhood, you know, hanging out with elderly sisters in my congregation and helping them with their gardening and running errands for them, and sort of, you know, we talk about paradise together, and, you know, you just have a lot more in common than, you know, it's not about, you know, your color or your nationality or any of those kinds of things. You have this sort of shared belief and this sort of shared frame of reference, which, you know, gives you like, you know, a global family. You know, if you travel to, I don't know, Vanuatu or, you know, Cape Verde or somewhere, or Venezuela, if you're going to stick with the letter V, you can just call the elders in a congregation wherever you're going, and someone will put you up. Like, you know, it's a wonderful community to be part of, if you believe in what they believe in, and if you don't step out of that. So on the other side of the coin, you've got the sort of it's anti-gay, it's anti-trans, anti-feminist, anti-choice. I sort of look at it now and I kind of think, actually, as a witness, I probably had more in common in terms of my political beliefs with, you know, Trumpism than I do with progressive politics. And that's, you know, what I align myself with now. So it's kind of shocking when you sort of think that, you know, that's where I come from. I come from that sort of closed-mindedness. So it was important for me to show a way out of that, to show that, you know, the circumstances in which you're born into, the doctrine in which you're born into, it doesn't have to be permanent. You can move away from that. And I'm not saying that everyone has to engage in sex work. You know, I wouldn't recommend it. But, you know, there is a way out. And you can have a chosen family. You can sort of be the person that you want to be, not the person that you were raised to be necessarily. You know, it's the prodigal son story, but without, you know, the sense of, you know, having to go back with your tail between your legs, having failed in your sort of need to be out of that. I still think that religion can be a force for good because it gives people an outlet. It gives people a sense of community, as I've mentioned. So I didn't want to sort of come across as being sort of completely anti-religion and completely sort of closing the door on spirituality, because I know how important that is for some people. You look at the way the world is today and has been for a long time, and sometimes it can be very confusing if you don't have the tools to sort of create a sort of, you know, an alternative. Religion is something to fall back on, and I really sort of respect that. But as far as I'm personally concerned, I don't need it anymore. I've got literature.
Yes, that's a good replacement. I mean, one of the many moments with regards to the Jehovah's Witness stuff in the novel that really struck me was, I can't remember where it comes exactly in the story, but Jesse, or another, I think it's Jesse, is sort of imagining this kind of Armageddon scene, and you know, you get this sense that, you know, quite young children are schooled, for want of a better word, to think on Armageddon and to look towards it from really quite a young age, and that's a remarkable. It was a remarkable. I mean, you sort of know on an objective level, yes, this happens in lots of religious communities, but yeah, when you're reading it in the novel, you're like, wow, that's quite a way to treat kids.
Yeah, I mean, you're indoctrinated into a culture of fear, and, you know, the great fear is that you will die at Armageddon. And the great hope is that you'll survive Armageddon and live forever on a paradise earth. And so they give you these brochures, like there's a brochure called "Look, I Am Making All Things New." And the cover of it is this really sort of like brightly colored, like saturated colors scene. And you've got sort of Mount Fuji in the background, and you've got sort of all the trees and flowers and plants and tropical birds you could ever imagine. And in the foreground, all laughing together, you've got, like, you know, really sort of like multicultural group of people, all sort of sharing fresh fruits together. And like in the background, you've got like little children playing with a lion that's really docile, and, you know, swans and flamingos sharing a brook, crystalline water. And, you know, that's when you look at what's going on in the world, war, famine, you know, climate change, etc., etc. It's really appealing to think that that could be the world. And so you sort of attach yourself to this sort of sense of hope. And everyone who's not a Jehovah's Witness is going to die. So there's, like, you know, 8 million Jehovah's Witnesses in the world, and everyone who's not a Jehovah's Witness is going to die. And so for me, at one point, like after I'd left, I was like, wait, so that means that, like, after Armageddon, we're going to have to bury, like,
Yes,
6 billion people, 7 billion people between us, like, across the world. Like, that doesn't sound like paradise to me. That sounds like backbreaking slavery. That looks and I'm just, that sort of, yeah, no.
That moment in the novel just felt like a kind of an amazing kind of medieval theological debate about what is paradise if we're having to bury all these 6 billion bodies.
I mean, it's a good job they're giving us everlasting life, because we're gonna need it. Like, it's gonna take us 1,000 years to bury all those people.
Yeah, I was
we're gonna be able to enjoy ourselves after that. Thanks, great. Like,
yes,
amazing.
Yeah. And I suppose you've got another rest of eternity to get over the trauma, kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good.
No, that's fair enough. And so the other thing I felt about reading Rainbow Milk, that it was very visual. Your prose style really does conjure up pictures in front of the reader's eyes. There are lots of really vivid descriptions in the novel. There's lots of attention to detail. You also get a real sense of the characters, especially from the dialogues and the kind of, I mean, a brilliant bit I thought was when you have those pages where you've got the restaurant, and it's all the things that people say in a restaurant, which, you know, I'm imagining maybe, like many of us, we've worked in restaurants waiting, and, you know, and I was just listening, because, you know, when I was a student, I spent many years working in restaurants, and I was like, God, yeah, people do say these awful things, or these really patronizing things like, oh, you're doing so well, our daughter does this too, and you're like, oh God. And so there was a sense of kind of cinematicness to the novel, and so I really could visualize this kind of really lavish BBC series. So it's a very middle class thing to say, it has to be a BBC series or some sort of film about it. And, you know, I was sort of, you know, if there are any film producers out there listening in, please take note. But, you know, if you could choose, who would you cast in the leading roles? You know, there was no budget to this, you know, so.
Well, I mean, okay.
Think big, come on.
Do I spoil this, or, I mean, do you know what, this book has really sort of, you know, it's only been out for 6 months, and it's already sort of got a lot of interest from a lot of different people, and I mean, I can't sort of say much more than Rainbow Milk does have a future beyond beyond the pages. So, I mean, it would be silly of me to speculate. I'd jinx myself if I speculated about casting. But yeah, it's so funny. Like, I had absolutely no intention of it being sort of cinematic, or, you know, I guess I just write in a very visual way. I guess that's just my style. And it's funny, my friend Will Eves emailed me after he'd read the book and said, it's a novel of scenes. It reminded him of something out of Fielding, he said, like, which I found like totally crazy, but probably quite apt. Like, you know, this sort of young man sort of trying to figure out his own existence and who he was, sort of like moving from scene to scene and sort of being shaped by the people he's with, and etc. etc. And I guess, you know, it was really important to do that for reasons that we've spoken about. You know, there's so many kind of situations that we take for granted that we haven't seen from the perspective of someone like Jesse. And because he's leaving behind a very, very, very strict sort of almost prison, and he's moved to London and he's free all of a sudden, he's aware of everything happening around him, and he's learning. He's like a baby, like just taking in so much information and sort of learning at that rate, learning about sex and learning about, you know, wine and food and, you know, different accents. You know, coming from the West Midlands, coming from the Black Country, he would have never heard French people. He would never have, you know, we take this for granted in London, especially now. But, you know, late 90s, early 2000s in the Black Country, Jesse would never have heard someone speaking French, Portuguese, Italian, Spanish. So to hear those accents and to sort of, you know, decode what these people are saying and sort of translating it in his head, like, you know, I wanted us as an audience to experience that in real time with him. And so that was the main reason for it being, and also the fact that you're sort of writing about a 19-year-old, you know, he hasn't got much of an inner life yet, really. So, you know, everything is sort of so immediate and so much about, you know, the sort of the experience and what he's then going to learn from it. So it's been really sort of unexpected, but amazing that it's had such a positive reception from people in the film and TV worlds. It's been a great compliment to me, and that's sort of really all I can say right now.
I won't push you any further. You're being very grown up.
I want to play Jesse, actually. Like, I'm pretty too old now, though.
No. But I mean, are you considering doing if there were ever a screenplay, is that something you'd be interested in doing yourself, or do you think that is it something, you know, you'd rather someone else do? Or yeah, I mean, is in writing a screenplay, would that seem to you like such a different thing from writing a novel, or is it a kind of a natural extension from writing the novel, do you think?
Writing a novel, as anyone who's written fiction will know, is a very sort of singular, lonely, isolated experience necessarily, and that's great. Like I don't mean that in a sort of woe is me kind of poor little fiction writer kind of way. But screenwriting is collaborative, and it's great fun to sort of be in a room with experienced TV and film people, sort of, you know, talking about a subject or talking about characters and talk about storylines and sort of how to really sort of, either adapt them or sort of, you know, engendering them in the first place. So, you know, my book's been out for 6 months, and, you know, I'm very, very lucky to be in a position where the market in TV and film has really opened itself up to previously of underrepresented voices. So I'm lucky to be around at a time where, you know, people are looking for writers like me. So, you know, while I'm still sort of studying and all of that, and sort of dealing with the aftermath of publishing a novel, it's really sort of tantalizing, the sort of prospect of working on screenplays and sort of maybe just sort of experimenting and diversifying my creative sort of toolbox, I guess.
And you're currently, obviously, as we mentioned earlier, studying for the MA in Black British Literature at Goldsmiths. And do you find that there's a creative synergy for you between sort of theory on the one hand and fiction on the other? And, you know, you like sort of going between the two, if you know, there's, I mean, that's kind of essentializing both categories, but for you, it's helpful for the creative process to kind of, you know, envelop yourself in theory and that sort of world, as well as the history of fiction and stuff like that.
Well, at the moment, I mean, I'm sort of quite bogged down in like theory, so it's difficult for me to raise my head and sort of see it from an objective point of view. But I'm really, I chose to enroll on the MA after I'd submitted my novel, the final version of my novel. A, because I didn't think my novel would be successful, but B, I wanted to inform my future work through studying Black British literature. And this course at Goldsmiths, it's been around for about 5 years. And when I started my application, I found that I'd abandoned a previous application from back in 2016. So it was clear that I sort of had this in mind to do at some point. But also, you know, for intellectual development. And as I was saying earlier, I can't remember if I was saying this to you personally earlier before we came on or during the actual event, but I didn't know anything about my family history in terms of the Windrush generation. So my grandparents, all 4 of them, were born in Jamaica and came to the UK in the late 1950s as part of the Windrush generation. But I didn't know anything about them or that time until I read Small Island. and could sort of project that experience onto them, because they were always so circumspect about that period. So for me, it was only going to be enriching to engage more with that period, to get across the thought and the theory that's been written. You know, people like Stuart Hall, like Kehinde Andrews, Paul Gilroy, you know, who Hazel Carby, Joan Animado, you know, people who've been writing about Caribbean writing and you know, race theory and decolonization, etc., for a very long time. Like, I was just completely ignorant of all of that, and I just didn't trust myself as a writer or as an artist, as a thinker. I didn't trust myself having a public voice without sort of being across all of that and sort of taking it all in and sort of forming my own opinion and being part of that conversation. And again, that's, you know, that sort of speaks of intersectionality. If I was white, I wouldn't necessarily have to do that. It sort of feels like the apparatus is already there for people. But as a Black writer and as part of a legacy that is a minority legacy, I just feel like I have to sort of do that. So, you know, maybe it'll end up being a PhD, which I'll have to do whilst writing another novel, whilst writing a screenplay. I don't know. I'm just going to be very busy.
You need 3 hands, basically.
Yeah, exactly. 3 heads. I need to be 3 people.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, fab. We've got a few questions. I'm going to take all the questions, but in a slightly different order, actually, from where they've popped up. So we'll begin with Mark's question. Thank you, Mark. Mark says, you mentioned Baldwin and Winterson. And so Mark would like to know, who are your go-to Black/queer writers, fiction, theory, whatever, who excites you the most?
So I love, obviously, James Baldwin is #1. I've read pretty much, well, I've read all of his novels. I haven't finished Just Above My Head, actually.
That's brilliant, that one, yeah.
Right. I got to the bit where, well, I can't actually, just in case people haven't read it. But like, I just got to a bit where I just had to put it down, because I was like, whoa, that is like, that's way out. Like, but like, he's just incredible. And his nonfiction as well, like reading Notes of a Native Son. Yeah, is that Notes of a Native Son? Sort of in my mid to late 20s. It was sort of my awakening, really, because, you know, for the first time I saw a Black male writer sort of really stepping into my brain and sort of telling me what I've been through. And, you know, the line where he says, so he worked in New Jersey for a while before he emigrated to Paris. And he says, you know, I learned in New Jersey that to be a Negro is to constantly be aware of other people's responses to your presence, or words to that effect. And that really sort of made me realize, like, as a Black man, that's why people cross the street sometimes when they see me. That's why people sort of, you know, affect all of these racial microaggressions against me. And, you know, I'm right to feel slightly weird about that. Like when someone says to you in a restaurant, as you were saying, where are you from? Because when you're telling them the specials of the day, they're sort of glazed over because they can't believe someone who looks like you, has an accent like you do, and has diction like you do. You know, it was only literally reading James Baldwin that I realized that. So like, he is absolutely my go-to. No surprises there. But I also love, I love Marlon James. I love Kehinde Andrews. Like, I'm reading his Back to Black at the moment, and I absolutely adore him. Like, you know, he's just done the most. Professor Hilary Beckles wrote this incredible book about reparations, and he's like the vice chancellor or vice dean of the University of the West Indies. A really sort of great voice. David Olusoga as well, you know, in terms of Black history, and, you know, just going to places where, you know, at least, you know, in terms of commercial writing, no one's really ever been before, in terms of putting himself on the BBC with films that sort of really go into Black British history. Queer writers, Marlon James, I may have said already, love him. A Brief History of Seven Killings really gave me permission to write Norman's story in Jamaican Creole. Okechi Kurunzelu, whose novel The Private Joys of Nana Maloney is just out in paperback. Love that. Love Brandon Taylor's Real Life. You know, I'm maybe sort of coming up with quite sort of contemporary figures, but that's simply because there've just been so few Black, queer, British voices. Kai Miller, of course, everyone should read his work. August Town has just, I think it's just been publicly announced that that's going to be a film. Steve McQueen and Courtney Newland. Courtney Newland as well, he's like a big figure. Bernardine Evaristo, Girl, Woman, Other. Like, I really wanted to tear my manuscript up when I read that. Like, I just thought, well, this is the way forward. So, like, you know, what have I done? Yeah, I think that's enough of a reading list for now.
That's a great reading list for people to be getting down. It's a good Christmas list, you know.
Yeah.
I'll turn to another question, if you don't mind sticking around for a few more minutes, Paul. Chase would like to know, do you have a project idea or story that you're thinking about at the moment that you might like to pursue next?
You're really trying to get all of this out of me, aren't you? Like I said, I mean, there's certain things that are happening behind the scenes that haven't been announced yet, so I can't really talk about them.
Okay, sorry, Chase.
Very exciting.
So, you know.
Very exciting indeed. So watch this space, y'all.
Okay, brilliant.
You know, I'd love to work on another novel. And I do have something in mind. But yeah, I just have to sort of find the time to do the research. So, you know, I guess I can say that I'm very interested in, so I've written in Rainbow Milk, I've written about the late 1950s and the late 90s, early 2000s, going into 2016 and the referendum. But I'm really interested in the generation between the late 70s, early 80s, where the second generation Black British post-Windrush culture really sort of imposed itself on mainstream British culture with music, fashion, food, etc., etc. You know, the art scene at that time, you know, the Black Art Group that was founded at Wolverhampton Polytechnic, you know, writers, artists like Keith Piper and Claudette Johnson, who, you know, were really inspired by the writings of Stuart Hall and the sort of the Birmingham School. You know, I'm really interested in that period. You know, I love all of the music and the culture of the late 70s and early 80s, whether it's post-punk, industrial, synth, dub reggae, roots reggae, like all of that stuff, lovers rock, all of that stuff. So yeah, I'm really sort of drawn to that period, and that will be my sort of, you know, Rainbow Milk was the book that I had to write, but I think the next book will be the book that I want to write.
I mean, that's another thing we could spend ages talking about, is the centrality of music in the novel, you know, and the centrality of music to being gay, and how, you know, everything. There's a great line in the novel where, you know, you write, you know, everything in gay life sort of happens to a soundtrack. Kind of.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, you know, music surrounds us. You know, I listen to music while I'm writing as well. So, and also music as an anchor. As much as taste and smell, I think taste, smell, and music are the three things that really sort of anchor memories. So when you hear a song that you haven't heard for a very, very long time, like even if it's a song that you don't really like. I was at the Lyric Theatre just before the first lockdown to see Love, 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 and during the second interval for the period that so there's three parts to it, two intervals. The first interval was just before the scene set in 1990. So they were playing Roxette's It Must Have Been Love on repeat. And I hate that song, but it really sort of like put me back to being 8 years old. at my parents' house, and I could sort of really sort of see everything, the decorating as it was. I could see the Goblin Hoover, like, you know, right there, and, you know, I'm sort of reading the Watchtower and sort of studying for my Sunday meeting and all of that, like, you know, and I just was struck by the strength of the quality of memory that that song, which I've not heard since because I hate it, elicited. So, you know, music is, and it's very interesting to see Candice Carter-Williams in her column in the Guardian write exactly that, that music can really sort of affect the way she writes, and she now creates playlists to work with certain aspects of her work.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And so one very final question, I promise, and it won't be about, you know, what's happening next. So Pippa would just like to know, do you have any tips or advice for writers, queer writers who are just starting out? What would you have liked to know when you were just beginning this project, basically? So as the grand old dame that you've become, what can you teach the next generation?
Well, I mean, what I would say is for any sort of, you know, person of minority status, if you like, just have the best people around you. Like, have people around you who believe in you and who you trust. Don't, you know, get rid of people who question you. I had so many people over the years say, you know, why are you writing about your experiences? Like, you know, who cares? You know, everyone's got their own life. Like, who cares about you? And that can be really destabilizing for a young person who doesn't have the confidence, you know, especially when you don't see people who look like you or have your descriptors on the shelves in bookshops. You know, you're sort of relying on people around you to sort of give you a bit of a leg up and give you a bit of confidence. And when they sort of dog you out, like, it's, you know, it's the last thing you need. So I would say get rid of those people and just surround yourself with people who, not sycophants, obviously. You need people who are going to, you know, be critical of your work, but, you know, make sure that's constructive criticism, that it helps you become a better writer. And I would also say, you know, read. You know, more important than writing in the first instance. Spend more time reading than writing, because that's what's going to give you permission. You know, you'll sort of, if you read widely, you'll sort of find different aspects of your identity in different novelists' work, in different poets' work, etc., etc. You'll, you know, you know, we're so lucky in this country because we've got like a huge canon, and so much gets translated as well for our market and for the American market. So we really do have a wealth of the world's knowledge available to us. Why would you just go out and sort of, you know, assume that you could just sort of go straight in without reading anything and just sort of, this is what I have to say, because no, you're part of something much bigger, and you sort of have to know from whence you came, you know, in James Baldwin's words, before you sort of add your 2 pence worth. So definitely that. And also, like, don't be afraid of being stuck. If I'm stuck on something, I start a new page, and that sort of completely sort of gives me a, you know, a blank slate literally to start again with, and I automatically find that I've solved the problem that I had. And also read your work aloud, even if you think it's finished, because you will hear bumps in the road, you'll hear moments where it could be said simpler. And that's sort of what you want to go for, really, is simplicity. And again, quoting James Baldwin, sentences as clean as a bone.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. That's brilliant advice for everyone here.
I'm such a Baldwin stan. I'm so sorry. I will try to stand for other writers at some point. Oh, shout out to Derek Owusu as well. He's a really great writer who you should all be reading.
Well, thank you very much. And Pippa says thank you as well. So, I'd just like to thank Paul again, as well as Ali, for doing such a brilliant job this evening and spending time with us. Thank you everyone for coming along to the first event of Queer at King's this year. It's wonderful, even though I can't see anyone. It's delightful to see so many of your names in front of me. So I wish everyone well, and see you at the next Queer at King's event. So thank you very much, guys.
Thank you all for joining us. Take care.